Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 231. If you rearrange those numbers, it's 1, 2, 3, or 3, 2, 1. That is a good sign. If you just rearrange those numbers, it's a countdown to fun, and that's what we're all about here on the Board Game Barrage, a podcast about board games, the latest hotness, and how to have fun with your friends, even when you're losing, Kellen.
Yes.
Nealon is really trying to whip up the energy because this is, as last week was, an 8:30 a.m. record. So
yeah, exactly.
I appreciate Nealon doing whatever he can to get us going. So
Right. If I don't, I'm going to fall asleep. With me, you've heard the voices of the red tank, Kellen, and the green tank's Mark. Good morning.
Hey,
Good morning.
I'm just hoping my husky morning voice carries through, that I don't get too excited.
I did mention this in the Discord. I laughed so hard listening back to last week's episode and just hearing the gravel in our voices, like right from the get-go. So that's great. We got that going for us.
You know, the best part of that is it really aids those writing Board Game Barrage fanfic. I think having
exactly. Yeah, use this for all your voice samples.
That's right.
Speaking of voice samples, if you were to do a lot of talking in the board game, you might be playing a negotiation game, which is what we're talking about this episode of the show.
A professional here, guys.
Yeah, there we go. How's that for a segue? Negotiation is something that comes up in a lot of board games. We're going to be talking about all those aspects, where we like it, where we think it doesn't work, but that's coming up later in the episode. Before we get there, we're going to be talking about Septima, a brand new release on Kickstarter, and Kremlin. Let's kick it off with Septima.
How are you going to kick it off to yourself, Nealon?
Yeah.
Are you that much of a professional?
It's like when a soccer player kicks it through somebody's legs, then runs around and gets the ball for himself.
We didn't plan around the idea that the host doesn't introduce the first game, but here we go. Septima is a brand new game on Kickstarter from Mind Clash Games, and right off the bat, I want to say this was kindly sent to us in prototype form by Mind Clash. So bear that in mind in the context of what we're talking about. This is very much a prototype game with prototype rules and prototype components. We do not know how much is subject to change between now and release. Septima is designed by Robin Hegedus, and in the tradition of Mind Clash games, this is a game that really leans on blending its theme and its mechanics. The theme of the game, broadly speaking, is that you are a coven of witches. Each player, I should say, is a coven of witches.
Mark, how do you say this word? Mark, how do you say this word?
You definitely say coven. You do not say coven.
Yes!
I don't know if that's true.
Kellen
100% true.
Ripped me to shreds for pronouncing this coven yesterday.
It is 100% coven.
I'm pretty sure it's coven.
There's a whole joke about this. I think it's called The Great American Movie or American Movie. It's this documentary about these two guys who are trying to make this horror movie in the backwoods in the South or something. It's a documentary. And one of the funny things about it is they want to name their movie Coven, and they think it's pronounced Coven. So the whole time they're talking about, we're making this movie called Coven, and everybody's like, wait, do you mean Coven? And they're like,
I see that. That's the bit. That's great.
Well, no, but it's a documentary, so these guys legitimately think, Kellen. Yeah, the filmmakers legitimately think that Coven is the way to say it, and they're going to name their movie Coven. And part of the funny things about the movie is that everybody tells them wait, do you mean Coven?
Here's the thing, right? Have any of you met a witch?
Not in a while, but.
So in Septima, every player is playing a witch's coven. You are effectively a community of witches around the outskirts of a small town, and what you're going to be doing is traveling out into the woods to collect ingredients, using those ingredients to brew potions, using those potions to heal patients that are back in the middle of the town. But a lot of the actions that you can take in the game raise the suspicion of the witch hunters, which hover at the edges of the board. And if your suspicion is high enough and you do a suspicious action close enough to a witch hunter, your leader might get caught, which has consequences. So there's a little bit of this element of this basic loop of getting ingredients, getting potions, healing patients, with this push your luck. How far are you willing to go to do a suspicious act at the edge of the board where the rewards are stronger, but the risk is higher? That is married with a sort of baked-in card negotiation system where over the course of a given season of the game, of which there are 4, you're going to be taking 5 actions, represented by a deck of 9 cards that every player has.
What is the minimum amount of cards required to have a deck?
Yeah, as I was thinking of the word deck, I was like...
Because in my mind, it's 10, and it's established by Dominion, so this is not a deck of cards.
This is not a deck?
But a hand. But I don't know anything about witches or the that you two know about the covens.
Quest for El Dorado has a starting deck of 8 cards, for what it's worth. Now what, Callan?
Those are small cards, so those are hard,
Yeah,
taxing on my hands.
Yeah. Relative to the thickness, it's all
Yeah, relative.
Yeah. This is married with a card action selection system where in any given season, you're going to be playing 5 actions and you can't repeat an action until the end of the season. But here's the twist that I think is potentially the most interesting part of the game and what ties into our topic is you're supposed to negotiate, talk openly about the action that you're going to take with other players. Why? Because if you take the same action as another player, you both get a little benefit. But you also both raise your suspicion. You're effectively communicating with other players. You raise the attention of the witch hunters is how they justify it. So the idea is that in any given turn, I might say to Kellen, like, hey, Kellen, we could both collect things this round because I really want that extra ingredient I'm going to get. And then Kellen has the choice to either like go along with me in this sort of vaguely semi-co-op sense or just be like, nah, I'm not going to do that. Or tell me he's going to do that and then pick a different card. You know, all of that is entirely up to Kellen. And then you reveal your cards and take your actions in turn order, getting the boost if you match with someone else. There's also a Septima, which is a non-player character who has an action you can match with, so you're not forced to match with other players, and that action rotates on a turn-by-turn basis. The other system that is a little bit independent of this all, which happens at the end of every season, is there's a trial that's happening. Now, there's either 1 or 2 trials, depending on if another player got caught. One thing I thought was kind of fun is if a player does get caught, their leader also goes on trial. And the way that this works is over the course of the game, you can also put loyal citizens into this crowd of meeples. They all get added to a bag and pulled out until you have a certain number. And if the loyal citizens outnumbers the angry citizens, then every player that was responsible for helping that trial gets a bunch of victory points, and whoever was the leader of that trial, who had the most contributed loyal citizens, gets that witch added to their coven, which either could give them a passive ability or the ability to get more end-of-game scoring points. Everyone also gets this objective card that is going to give them secret objectives that they're working towards at the end of the game.
So essentially, primarily on your turn, right, you are in a round, you are going to be venturing out into the forest with a move card, collecting ingredients with a collect card, returning back to the center, brewing them with a brew card, and then trying to heal sick patients. I think a large portion of your victory points are determined by how many of a certain type of patient that you heal, of which there are 3 types. But it is a little bit of a race because you can only heal the same patient if you do that on the same turn that someone else does. So if Neelan at the beginning of a round is able to heal the 2 red patients that I was hoping to heal, I have to change my plans. And it uses that system where in each season of the game, you can only use each card once, and then you get them all back. So you have some knowledge of what the other players may use, a little bit of think and double think about when is the best time to use each card. And then in addition to that, there's 1 card that allows you to repeat the action of one of the cards in your discard pile. A lot of this is fairly standard, move around a map, collect things, convert things. There's a giant list of all the potions that you can make, which are the 3 healing potions with 4 other special potions. But then the card selection system is novel, the trial system is novel, the charms give you, which we haven't even spoken about, give you all these special abilities that make you feel like a witch. Your leader witch also gives you special powers, which allow you to affect the board state. And then...
Shall we get to the caveat zone, Callan?
Oh, do we have one of those?
Oh, absolutely we do.
The caveat zone.
So here's my issue at large, I think, with some of this. I think that actually the system as we described it and the way it actually blends with the theme is really, really strong. Again, this is Mind Clash's specialty. I kind of couldn't shake the feeling that a lot of these systems were a little bit undercooked. And to be fair, some of that might get refined over the course of the Kickstarter. It's not impossible, but we can't guarantee that, right? We felt like some of the passive abilities were maybe a little bit less useful than others. And the game really wants to lean on you comboing those effectively with these charm cards, which are these very powerful cards that you can draft at various points in the game. But hitting on a combo and using it very effectively, if it is the only combo you're using effectively in that game, and if another person is not also able to construct that, it felt a little bit less great than it could have. Like, I loved looking at the charm cards and just seeing like how wild some of the powers were, but it didn't always lend itself to like, oh, here's the thing that's going to break this game wide open for me. The nature of the matching system is actually, I thought, cute, but also feels a little bit incidental for a couple of reasons. We sort of tried to play up very early in the game of like saying, okay, I'm going to do this, you're going to do this, let's try not to mess each other up. But because this is ultimately a puzzle Euro, there's a lot of specificity to the timing of your actions and when you do them. There's even like this lunar cycle that like dictates when certain ingredients can be collected, right? So you have to time your collect to specific points. It kind of feels like your actions almost have to form into a rote pattern in order to optimize them efficiently, which means you're not often that concerned with the person who's next to you is doing. As the game progresses, you're just sometimes benefiting off of the match and sometimes not, and actually sometimes to your detriment, because a rogue match can lead to your character getting caught, and that's part of the push your luck element to it. But it kind of just felt a little bit like it didn't work entirely as well as I'd hoped it would.
Nealon is downplaying my brilliance, which is that we started the first season and it was very cooperative. Okay, I'm going to do this, we're going to match. And then I believe in the second season, I realized I could heal some patience that Nealon wasn't going to be able to get to. But if he knew what I was doing, he might be able to get there. So we put our cards face down and he's like, okay, what's everybody doing? Kirsten says what she's doing, and then I just say, oh, I don't want to say. And he was not thrilled with that. And then I flipped it over, and then he was very upset because at that point he could see that on the next action I was going to heal those patients, and he no longer was able to mirror what I was doing. But yeah, I think the word semi-co-op is sort of a sacred word for me, and I don't think this rises to that level. I understand why they're describing it that way, but...
Totally. It's almost like it has semi-co-op elements, I guess, is maybe the most generous I would be about that. I get why they would describe it that way. One of the other bigger issues I had with it was the way that the jury system works, which should have been fun in my mind. As I was preparing for this game, I imagined the idea of these trials being this very fun moment of like, oh, we're going to pull stuff out of the bag.
Yeah, as you were describing it, Neil, it sounded like an exciting time. As a person who's not played the game and doesn't know much about it aside from what you've told me, that sounded like a moment of excitement, potentially.
And I think potentially in the right crowd, in the right group, it could be, but I also think that it highlights what is a little bit awkward about Septima for me, which is it's kind of falling into this weird space by design, right? They're describing this as the most accessible Mind Clash game yet, which is factually true, but you're talking about a game that is still a medium-heavy game, right? Mind Clash traditionally makes pretty heavy games, but it also has more of this sort of like futziness that's a little bit more thematic oriented rather than mechanically sound, which just puts it into this pretty awkward range where I'm not convinced that this is going to be any heavy gamer's favorite game or any medium weight gamer's favorite game. And like, that's me presuming a lot potentially, but I'm not convinced.
No, I mean, I think that's at the heart of it. What's weird to me about the game is that your turn-by-turn action is so puzzly, right? It's like, which ingredients are in season? What does the Septima want? How many squares away am I from ingredients? How much threat do I have on this track? Combined with all the cards are in play. It's a very puzzly sort of do the math for each card for the rest of that season, because you only have 20 actions in the whole game in order to score points. And then everything that's thematic about it starts tripping up. Like, you could lose your hero witch on a die roll to the trial. You could get screwed because another player plays a card that they should not have played. And it just feels like those systems don't feel as connected to me. It's almost like, and again, party game is extremely not the right word, but it's like a heavy gamer's party game, which is to say that they're going to play this when it doesn't matter as much who would win the game. I don't know.
Totally. No, I think that makes sense. It reminds me of like what I said about Dead Reckoning a week ago, right? Which is in that realm of very heavy war games, you have to be okay with a lot of just like the futziness of it to like this, but it doesn't sit with me as well in the context of that because it's more of like a puzzly design. And I want my puzzles to click together nicely and not just be jostled completely when someone comes in and like steals some of my pieces. You know, like it feels like it's just awkward in that space.
I mean, there is a lot of player interaction, right? Which is interesting, and it's funny how they have sort of couched it positive player interaction is the term they're using on their BGG page, which I don't know that I agree with. I think there's a lot of positive player interaction. I don't know what I think about the term positive player interaction. But for a heavy Euro game, there is a lot of ways in which you can sort of meddle with what's happening, which is interesting.
I do want to talk about the production before we end this, which I think is, even in prototype form, pretty impressive. All the pieces are silk-screened wood for like the ingredients. The art on the board is gorgeous. I thought so personally, at least. I thought it was stunning visually. It probably could use a lot of refinement in terms of readability, which I hope will come down the line. I was actually interested to see that the board on Kickstarter already looks pretty substantially different from the one we played with, so I'm sure they're doing a lot of that process of refining it. But even in prototype form, this was a beautiful looking game.
So, Neil, Mind Clash, as you mentioned, are known for really, really heavy games and games that, can integrate the theme in those heavy games. You mentioned that this is supposed to be their sort of foray into like a relatively lighter fare. Does the game drag? How does the playtime work?
So it's definitely shorter than the other Mind Clash games I've played. Like, again, they are typically quite heavy, and I would say at a minimum 2-hour-long games by default. Septima, they are claiming is under 2 hours. Our first play of it, I should say, was just over 2 hours at 3 players. I'm very confident that would come down to under 2 hours, even on the second play, because the turns do move quickly, right? It's reveal a card, take the action. The actions are all pretty simple. Some of them are just like move, pick up ingredients. I think that if you were spending a lot of time analyzing your optimal play and sort of trying to like talk with other players every single turn to figure out the best thing you could do, it could probably drag, but that would be pretty player dependent. I remember like saying this at times. I was like, oh, this is really moving. We were just taking turn in quick succession sometimes, and then other turns drag just depending on the context. But yeah, no, I thought it moved at a pretty good pace, to be quite honest.
Cool.
I would say overall, I like this. I tend to like these sorts of puzzle mechanisms in games. I had a good time with the semi-negotiation part of it. I think that's an interesting system. I have some issues that I'm very curious to see how they bear out over the long term. But yeah, I had fun with this.
I think it's no surprise to long-time listeners of the podcast, I don't generally like puzzly heavy Euro games. And I think that bore out here. I admire the art style. And I think it's a interesting take on trying some new mechanisms within that puzzle space. But yeah, it isn't something for me, but I can see why the Nealans of the world dig it.
This is, at the time of release, still live on Kickstarter if you're interested in checking it out. There is a tabletop simulator module available to play, so you can give it a go for yourself. That's Septima by Mind Clash Games and Robin Hegedus. Mark, tell us about Kremlin.
So I've been really wanting to get my unplayed games played recently, and particularly the older ones for a number of reasons. Yes, because they're the oldest games I have that are unplayed, but mostly because they're the ones that I'm most confident have stood the test of time and sort of also give me a chance to fill in holes for classic games that I've yet to play. So to that end, I finally got a chance to play Kremlin. This is a game by Urs Hostetler, originally from 1986, but the version I played was the 1996 third edition by Jolly Roger Games. Quick aside, can either of you name Urs Hostetler's most famous design?
If I knew who that person was, I could maybe name their most famous design.
It's Urs Hostetler, the game designer.
Oh, that helps.
It's Tichu. Isn't that crazy?
That's interesting.
Yeah, I assume Tichu was some sort of like folk game that got passed down.
Yeah.
Countries. And in fact, it does get many of its rules from a folk game called Zengfen. But yeah, Urs Hostetler is the designer of Tichu, which is crazy.
I think Tichu actually gets some crap for pretending in the rule book like it is in fact like a passed down
game.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Well, no, that it's like been passed down for generations in China.
Oh, because it is based quite a bit on a folk game called Zengfen.
Yeah.
So while we're on Hostetlers, can either of you name the Giants quarterback who took over for Phil Simms late in the season back in the 90s and guided them to a Super Bowl championship?
You're appealing to like 4 people, Mark, who listen to this.
The answer, of course, is Jeff Hostetler. That's all the Hostetler trivia I know. Anyway, back to Kremlin. So we played the third edition. A quick note about that is the rules offer 3 ways to play. There is the standard version, which is the original version as Urs intended, and it's sort of like a tongue-in-cheek look at Russian politics. There is the version based on the early Avalon Hill revision of the game, which is much darker in tone and mixes historical politicians with fictional ones. And then there is the modern version, which tries to incorporate some modern design elements and uses only modern politicians. So here's where you'll find your Putin card and your Gorbachev card. Couldn't really find a consensus as far as the best way to play, so we went with the standard original version. So my discussion of the game will be based on that. In Kremlin, you'll start the game out by dealing cards representing politicians on this pyramid of power representing the Russian Politburo, which is sort of their house of government. At the top of the pyramid is going to be the party chief, sort of the head of the government. And then down the line, you'll have the rest of the politicians that make up the administration, including the head of the KGB, the foreign and defense ministers, as well as the ministers of sport, ideology chief, so on and so forth. So those are the cards that are dealt at the top of the pyramid. They take up these places of power. Below these 8 top officials, you'll have 5 cards representing those that are in government, but not yet in these positions of power. And then below those, you'll have a number of cards representing aspiring politicians who are not yet in the government. At the end of every round, you'll see whether or not the party chief can muster the strength to wave at the crowd at the annual May Day parade. If they're able to do so 3 times, then whoever has the most influence on the party chief wins the game. So let's talk about influence and why the party chief might not be able to make it to the parade. So when the politicians are initially dealt out, you'll secretly, on a piece of paper, assign an amount of influence to them. So you assign 10 points to one, 9 points to another, 8 to the next, all the way down to 1. So you'll assign 10 politicians an amount of influence that you'll keep secret. These can be anyone in government or even those that are not yet in power. So on the piece of paper that you have, you'll have all the politicians listed as well as their ages, which I'll get into later. And then before the game starts, you'll see who's in power, who's not in power, and you'll assign them influence points.
Sorry, are you telling me that the primary way to win Kremlin is to secretly select that you want Putin to go to the parade 3 times and then to have that in fact transpire?
So if in the modern version, if you wanted to, where Putin's in the modern version and in the Avalon Hill version, if you wanted to back Putin, as I guess your inclination is, Kellen, which is weird if you ask me, yes, you could try to raise Putin to power. Again, a very weird thing to want, Kellen, but again, to each their own.
No, you're telling me...
I'm more of a Gorbachev guy. I'm more of a glasnost sort of guy. But if you want Putin,
thought it was about raising power and assassinating people. You're the one talking about parades.
Look, you're wearing your red CCCP shirt right now.
You're going to get me on a list.
Red tank.
You're putting me on a list
it all
right
makes
now.
sense. Oh my God. What have we signed up for?
But to answer your question, yes, basically that is basically what you can do in this game. Speaking of influence, so you write down these points for the different politicians, and at any time you can reveal an amount of influence on a politician. So if I have 8 points on a politician, Viktor Aparatchik, for example, who's one of the politicians we played with, I have 8 points on him. At any time in the game, I can say, hey, I have 3 points on Viktor, and I put my faction's 3-point marker on him. The reason I might say 3 and not 8 is because I don't necessarily want other players to know that I have more influence on him. So Kellen might see this and might want to take control of Viktor immediately and say, hey, I have 4 points on him. And then I might say 5 to raise him and to keep control of Viktor, or I might pretend that I don't have enough to beat Kellen's number, and then I just sort of lay low for a time, maybe later to reveal that I do indeed have more. The reason that you want to have influence and control politicians is because it allows you to then take their actions. So each turn is made up of a number of phases. In the purge phase, which I can see Kellen's eyes light up when I mention a purge phase, whoever controls the head of the KGB can try to kill other politicians in government, take them out. In the investigation phase, whoever controls the defense minister can drum up suspicion and put politicians on trial and send them to Siberia. And all this stuff, if it doesn't kill people or send them to Siberia, can put stress on them and age them. So now we're getting back to the age idea, which is another big concept in the game. So every politician starts out at a certain age, and then these actions, whether they happen to them or they're taken by them, can cause them to age up, at which point you'll put a chit on the card showing that they've gotten older. So, for example, Viktor can start out as 80. When he does something, it might stress him out, age him up, and you put a 1 over the 0, and he's now 81.
Can they die?
Oh, yeah, they can definitely die.
Mark, I thought that this game was like dark, deeply, about murdering each other. You're telling me that this game is about backing Putin, getting him to 3 parades before he dies of old age.
Again, Kevin, that's just your read on this.
So let's talk about the health phase.
I don't believe you.
Let's talk about the health phase, where you roll a die to see if politicians get sick or, as Kellen has brought up, die based on their age. So that's a whole phase of the game. And that's a very fun, exciting phase because you go down the entire pyramid of government and you're like, okay, Victor's 85. Let's see if he makes it through. And you roll a dice and you check to see if he lives or if he just gets ill, which is another thing that happens to characters in this game. So as you can see, there might be a lot of spots open in government after all the illness and bloodshed take place. And
From dying of old age?
From dying of old age, from being sent to Siberia, or from being put on trial, or from being
thank God.
killed. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. So there's all these spots open, and then later on in the round, there's a phase where the people who are still alive, who are still in power, can promote or demote politicians and then fill the gaps. So they bring people from outside the government, in the government, or people from the lower ranks of the government higher up into the government. And this is how promotion happens, and you can get a person from the bottom all the way to the party chief.
And are there special powers assigned to each politician or the space that they're currently in?
Right. So no powers are assigned to the politicians. They're all based on the space they're in. So whoever is the head of the KGB is the one who can try to take out other politicians. But if they're incapacitated when their action comes up, then it sort of falls down the pyramid. So if the head of KGB is out, then it might be like the ideology chief who's below them, who now is in charge of taking people out.
Right. Like
which happens quite a bit.
Yeah, if like the top 31 people in the government get taken out at once, then it's the, Department of Education secretary that becomes the president.
That's exactly right. I can see you've watched, what is that show called?
For me, it's Battlestar Galactica, but I know you're thinking of like Lone Survivor.
Yeah, Lone Survivor. That's right. Lone Survivor, which I didn't see, but whatever.
Long live Laura Roslin.
Okay, so then after all this rearranging and new blood and replacement and all this stuff, you see at the end of the round if the party chief is well enough to wave to the crowd. So if they're healthy, it's an automatic success. Boom.
You're lying. This is
Kremlin. These are the rules. You can transcribe what I'm saying now, print them out, and just make them the rule book.
Not only do they have to get to the ceremony at the parade, they have to be healthy enough to wave to the crowd.
That's correct. That's absolutely right. So if they're healthy, boom, easy wave. They're healthy, they stand up, they wave. But if they're sick, or if worse, they're ill, then you have to roll a die. And if they're sick, you have to roll I think over a 7. If they're ill, you have to roll over a 14. So you got to see if you can do it. In addition to all of this, there are these event cards that you'll have and might be able to rarely acquire throughout the rest of the game, so they don't come in a whole bunch. And you can play them to mix things up, to sort of like throw wrenches and alter the rules a little bit. You can also trade these cards, and in fact, you can trade promises as well. So this is where today's topic of negotiation comes in with Kremlin. If someone's, say, in charge of the KGB, you might ask them to lay off a certain politician, and then maybe you won't have one of their politicians sent to Siberia later. So you can say, hey, lay off Alexei and I will keep my hands off of Mikhail. In practice, we found that it didn't happen too much in our game because people didn't want to reveal who they had influence on. But I think on repeated plays, you might bluff that. You might say, hey, lay off Mikhail, but really you don't care about Mikhail, but now everybody thinks you care about Mikhail. So further plays might bear out the negotiation a little bit more. Another thing about the way we played it, we had this going as a 3-player game, which worked fine, but I felt like it might be better at a higher player count, and this game goes up to 6, so that might be another way that negotiation comes into it, because there's more people fighting over these politicians.
Okay, so here's where it just makes sense to mention. There is a rework of this game called Nothing Personal, and rework is not the right word, like a re-implementation of most of the mechanisms, actually made by one Mr. Tom Vassell of the Dice Tower.
Huh, never heard of him.
Called Nothing Personal. And I really like Nothing Personal. It was in my top 50 for many years, just fallen out from lack of play. Is the blackmail chip available in Kremlin?
The blackmail chip. So you can put suspicion on people, which might be what it is. So the defense minister in their phase, they can put suspicion on people and then later put those people on trial.
No, so
I've never played Nothing Personal.
Yeah, in Nothing Personal, you can place a token when you place influence on the different people, and then when they go to use their power, right, for where their position is.
Yeah.
They can only do it if they have the explicit permission of the player who placed the blackmail chip on them.
I see.
And so it becomes a negotiation for like, no, you can't kill the capo because I'm the capo, but if you use your kill ability to move someone else, I'm okay if you hurt Neelan with that.
Interesting. That might be part of the either the modern or the Avalon Hill rules, but in the rules that we played, that was not a thing. So I enjoyed Kremlin. It plays slightly quicker than I feared. For some reason, I thought this might be like a 3-hour monster. And maybe that's true for 5 or 6, but with 3, it took about 90 minutes for our first game. I also think it definitely benefited with a little bit of role play or storytelling. And I sort of alluded to this earlier, but we'd say stuff like, hey, you don't want to kill Alexei, he's a nice boy, or stuff like that. Or, before dice roll to see if she survives despite her illness and old age, you might say like, come on, Laika, make it one more year. We need you there at the parade. There's a lot of that stuff going on. And then you have a dice roll. And then there's like, there's like, okay, Laika's going to make it as long as you don't roll a 1. And then whoever controls Laika rolls the dice and it's a 1. And there's like this big eruption at the table as to Laika, unfortunately not making it to her 3rd parade or whatever. So if you're willing to accept a little bit of dice rolling, and these are sort of influential rolls, but I don't think it makes or breaks your game if rolls go poorly. And you're willing to sort of like buy into the fun of it, like the joking around, I think you could really enjoy Kremlin. Again, it's really benefited by the fact that while it's not a quick game, 90 minutes is not unreasonable. And having these secret influence that you write down sort of makes it a game unlike many other games. Again, of course, Callan has mentioned a game that is very much like, nothing personal, but it's unlike most games I think you've played. So not my favorite game of all time, but a fresh, unique game that I'd definitely play again if I wanted to have this sort of experience or to show people this novel sort of game. So that is Kremlin by Jolly Roger Games and Urs Hostetler.
It's interesting, like I jokingly posited before the start of the record of this that I might be the only person that cares about theme of the three of us grandly. Like, I look at Kremlin and I'm like, not even remotely interested in it based on the way it looks. But I think hearing you talk about it, and especially the way that Kellen has raved about Nothing Personal in the past, I'm intrigued by this.
I think you definitely enjoy it. I don't think you're going to love it. I don't think it's going to be your favorite game, but I think you're definitely... It's just like, if you're playing with a group that will table talk and trash talk a little bit, like, why are you so into Pavel? Like, why,
sure.
You know, that kind of thing. I think
if you're leaning into it a lot.
Yeah, it'll definitely be an enjoyable experience, I think.
I mean, imagine a new edition where there's like a little parade route. So when they're in that top position, they move down there. I feel like the visuals I've seen of Kremlin do not do this theme of getting to the parade before getting sick and having to go to the old people's home justice.
Yeah, right.
But there is a substantive difference, Mark. There is no hidden influence, I believe, in Nothing Personal. Like, who you are supporting is your own family, so it's much more explicit than sort of covert. So that is pretty major, yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, that makes it sound like it's pretty different, actually.
The feeling of it is probably quite drastic based on that.
Yeah.
Interesting. So before we get into our feature topic, I want to read out a review. This is something we used to do a lot of. If you leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, I think it's pretty much the only platform that actually gets to us, unfortunately. You might have your review read out on the show. So here is one from Regit that says, best board game podcast. Thank you very much. My favorite board game podcast for some time now, punchy, diverse, and well-articulated reviews that help me get a balanced perspective of games. Not afraid to criticize and compare, and episodes aren't too long. Keep up the good work. Thank you so much, Regit. That's very, very kind. Yeah, this is an excellent way that you can support the show. And one of the other ways that we wanted to call out is letting publishers know that if you'd like to hear us cover games. If a game comes out that, may or may not be on our radar and you think that would be something that we'd be interested in, let them know, whether it's through their social media or otherwise. It's just a good way to make them aware of the fact that, hey, here's a crowd of people that might be into the thing that you're putting out.
I think you'd just be shocked at how few review copies we actually get sent or considered for by the publishers. So, even letting them know, hey, I bought these games because Board Game Barrage covered them would immensely help us.
So yeah, that would be huge and really appreciated, and it would go a long way to helping us in the long run. So let's get into the feature topic, which is negotiation and how important that can be in certain game designs, whether it's the core component of a game or just a sub-aspect or one of its many mechanics. We thought this would be particularly relevant in the context of the two games we spoke about earlier. Like Kremlin and Septima both have negotiation elements baked into them, and the scale to which they use them is a pretty big element of their success or failure as negotiation games, right? So let's start there. Where do you guys like to fall on this line of like how much negotiation should be part of a game's design?
This is tough for me because I feel like my inclination is to say that I either like it to be quite a big part of it, like maybe the primary aspect to it, or a very light touch. Feels like those are the two places where I want it to be. I either want to be like, if we're negotiating in a game, let's make it big and let's make it count, or let's have it as a thing that's like on the side, sort of accentuating it. I feel like the times where I don't like negotiation is where it's sort of like halfway. Like it's a core mechanism, but not enough to be important and not light enough to be like sort of something that can be ignored. I feel like that's where I land, sort of on the poles.
It's really hard. I think I've always felt that we can go all the way back to the OG Daddy Euro itself, Catan. And I always thought that the negotiation of trading, which I guess trading is a subcategory of negotiation, always felt out of place in Catan for me. I was always like, I'm doing my thing, you're doing your thing, but that the winner is the one who successfully convinces someone else that their sheep is not as valuable as they think it is. But then on the flip side of that, I do think that's one of the novel standout features of Catan that has made it the worldwide phenomenon that it is today. I love negotiation in board games in general, but I think my broadest, biggest stroke on negotiation is that it doesn't work in first place. It barely works in second place. And so the current environment of board gaming doesn't do negotiation justice. Everyone is afraid to negotiate in a first play because no one knows the value of things. And then they move on to other games where they can't remember the value of things by the time they come back to it.
And I think you get around that a little bit in games where negotiation is like totally at the forefront, like Sidereal Confluence or like Game of Thrones, games where like you have to negotiate, where it's like, I guess maybe you would negotiate suboptimally or not as well or not as fun as you would in future games, which you may or may not play. But I think games where negotiation is like at the forefront, you can maybe avoid that problem, Kellen, a little bit, you think?
Yeah, I think that this goes deeply personal and something we have touched on the show before. Getting taken advantage of is something that I am like deeply afraid of, to the point that like Mark and I often talk about like trade values, like, hey, is it okay if I go to a garage sale and find a copy of Pokemon Blue and it's worth $1,000, but grandma only, is selling it to me for $20? Like, am I okay with that? And personally, right. I'm not, for whatever reason.
And everybody knows my stance on grandmas.
Yeah, you rob them blind, you jackass. And if we want to just get specific and rambly, because that's sometimes what podcasts are, I actually really, really, really dislike how it works in Sidereal Confluence, which I know is a total shot of a gun to Nealon.
Yeah.
Or maybe a die roll of old age. But in Sidereal, the game is like, hey, here's the value of everything. And so suddenly the game is less about negotiating the value of things and more about trying to find the synergies between the factions to produce the most efficient Euro puzzle.
Yeah. I'm not even going to dispute that, to be honest, because like I think one of the things that is maybe like and this is not a shot intended at you, but like maybe a misconception about Sidereal is, right, you could see that as the mean market value of everything, right? But every specific item in Sidereal has increased or decreased value to a specific faction. That's baked into the design of the game. Like, yellow cubes, are roughly equal to green cubes, but definitely one faction cares a lot more about yellow cubes and green cubes. So that is where the negotiation comes in. It's like someone that is not aware of that difference or how it affects you will just be like, yeah, I don't care. I'm producing yellow and green cubes in equal measure. But as the canny, like, Sidereal Confluence player is being more aggressive with those trades of yellow cubes to the player that needs them the most. And it is, I think absolutely it is about more reading the interplay between the factions, which doesn't come across in the first game, which I think would actually be something I should warn people more about in the context of Sidereal Confluence. Because Mark's
You sound like you're contradicting me, but I think you're only affirming what I'm saying, which is that...
Oh, yeah, no, I'm absolutely intending to affirm what you're saying. Yeah. I'm just saying I don't think that's a negative, is I guess what I'm trying to land on this.
Well, if a normal negotiation game takes 3 plays till everyone understands it, Sidereal Confluence takes 3 to the nth degree because of all the different factions. And so ultimately the winner in Sidereal Confluence is the one who tricks the people who don't understand because they haven't played it as often, that the value of their things is not as good as they think it is. But they're sort of buoyed by the fact that they have a chart that says gray equals 1/2 X blue.
I can get behind that. Look, I think that this is probably a problem of any negotiation game, right? Is that if someone understands the systems more intimately, they have a substantial advantage over people that don't, because you can just easily convince someone of something that they don't fully understand, Like, you could be like, oh, no, trust me, this is going to be mutually beneficial, Then one turn you later, no, you idiot, you didn't understand how this works. I actually am going up on you. And that's the least subtle way to do that, but that is baked into what Sidereal Confluence is. There's a reason Mark always wins Sidereal Confluence, because he's very, very good at that. He's very good at getting the edge up on trades in aggregate, right? And that's what the game of Sidereal Confluence is you making a lot of trades with Mark that you think are fair trades, but no, he is constantly increasing his value and getting a better deal from all of those, which adds up in the long run. Now,
before you go on, I feel like I owe it to the listeners here to reveal my secret about how to play Sidereal Confluence. So I'm going to reveal it here for the first time. This is a live exclusive. So you know how they say if you're afraid of public speaking, you should imagine everyone in their underwear to make it a level playing field so you're not so intimidated? So the way I do it is just, instead of Callan's head and Nealon's head and Christina's head, I replace everybody's head in my mind with grandma's. And then I'm like, I'm going to take advantage of these people.
But that element of it can be a problem for the ways that you mentioned, Mark, and that both of you mentioned, in fact. That I think actually in a first play of Sidereal Confluence, and I was exposed to this very recently for the first time in a very big way, where I played a 9-player game of Sidereal Confluence with mostly new players, right? And the thing that's hard is if you're not coming out of the gate swinging and knowing what to do and ready to negotiate, you sit and stare at your board in front of you in Sidereal, and you kind of I don't get this isn't really fun, I don't love this. Because if you're not all coming on it from an equal, hey, we're all here to get in each other's face and talk to each other and interact in that way, then players get left behind. Players that are not on that same footing can get left behind, and that's only exacerbated by the experienced players at the table.
I feel like there could be a role in Sidereal that I would love to play in a 9-player game. And again, we can move off of Sidereal because what would happen in a 9-player game is a bunch of unfair trades would happen, but you wouldn't even be privy to them because you're in a bunch of other unfair trades. So it's if someone's role was to try to make it as fair as possible in all the other trades, and then they would win based on how equal people were at certain points throughout the game. So your job is arbiter of justice to just run around and make sure no one's getting... That would be really funny.
I do think there's a role which we can talk about offline, which I think falls close to that, where you're just effectively the mob boss keeping all other players in check, and you're doing whatever it takes to do that. And I think the fun of Sidereal is it allows you to play with that structure and bring your own thing to it, which I think generally speaking is why I typically like negotiation elements in games, is that they introduce, this kind of goes back to what we were talking about a few episodes ago with meta, right? The idea of bringing in elements that are external to the game and making them a core part of the game. We often, Kel and I at least, rave about Inish. And Inish's combat system is effectively just a repeated series of negotiations, right? There are abilities that can trigger, but the large majority of conflicts in Inish are just a series of do you just want to keep hitting each other with sticks, or are we going to stop this until one of you just gives in? And I think that's part of the appeal.
Yeah, and I think Inish is a great example, right? Because negotiation is a subcomponent of every single area control game in existence, or even area majority games, right? Where there's a little bit of Mark, are you sure you want to come into my spot in El Grande? Because, I'm going to defend this with my life. And that would scare Mark, right? Because I'm pretty good at scaring him into compliance. But the beauty of Inish is that it makes that negotiation explicit rather than between the lines, which is it is how the conflicts are oriented, right? You can imagine in Blood Rage, the same thing happens where it's I've got a lot of good attack cards over here, which is a form of negotiating, right? You're hoping they will just lay down. And then in Inish, that is how the conflicts are resolved. And so that makes some people love Inish, right? And other people say, all it is people arguing for 3 hours and then someone wins.
And that is exactly where I fall on Inish and games of that ilk. Honestly, further to my point, like I like Sidereal Confluences. Like, okay, this is about negotiation and that's it. Like, this is what we're doing. And again, we quibbled about how much negotiation is in Sidereal, but it's like the talking and the back and forth trading is what it's about. And in El Grande, it's like these veiled threats or these bluffs where it's like you mix it up. But I think when negotiation is this like core but not focus component like it is in Inish, that does generally turn me off, because it feels like, to me, the best analogy I can come up with is like auctions in games that aren't great. Like, okay, there are problems with this game, but we're going to fix it because you guys are going to fix it, because you guys are going to talk it out, And so that's where like I think Inish sort of devolves for me into like this like talk about it, king making, don't let them win, all this stuff. And where auction games, when they go bad, it's like, okay, yeah, the economy's a little busted, but we're going to fix that because we're going to have an auction. And so you guys can figure out the values. So that's where I think negotiation can sort of be a plastering over the cracks sort of thing.
So here's something I want to ask you then, Mark, in that context. Pivoting to a game that I know you do like a lot, Rising Sun, right? Rising Sun has a similar style of negotiation is debatable in this context, right? But
Rising Sun comes from diplomacy.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, it's a diplomacy spiritual successor. So
yeah, right.
Bake is the core design. but a core part of the intent of Rising Sun is that during the tea party phase, you're discussing with other players, hey, let's join up to do this because I'm going to take this action, you could take this action, and there's a lot of negotiation and backstabbing that goes into that. But that works for you in that context, right?
Yeah, and the reason why is because I don't think it really works as intended. Because
Sure.
Because Rising Sun's supposed to be like, hey, a negotiating sort of game, but it's not really a negotiating game, but it's supposed to be big into the game. But I think in the end, what it is in Rising Sun, at least the times I've played it, is like it's a touch. It's like a little thing. It's, hey, join with me or else. It's a little bit of bluff. It's not like a focus of the game as much as maybe it was intended or sold as. And I think the way it comes off as a light touch works for me because it's not a vital part, yet not being the focus of it.
Well, it's like the alliances feel only positive. I know that might not always be true, but you almost always want to be in an alliance.
Right.
And so everyone is incentivized to just get together. And I think this dovetails nicely into a point I wanted to make, which is that oftentimes negotiation feels very harsh and shouty, but it doesn't always have to be. And I think that Rising Sun does a good job in that diplomacy phase of like everyone wants to link up. Everyone wants to go home with someone, but it's just about figuring out how to make that possible. And I think that a really, really underrated light game Between Two Cities is a negotiation game that feels almost entirely positive, right? All you're doing is deciding on your turn. You have 2 tiles and you have to put one in your left city, one in your right city. But your neighbors are like, no, like we need that here. And your other neighbor's like, no, we need that over here. And for whatever reason, it's just silly and it's like here or here, and it's like, well, I have to put this here or I have to put that there, and that for whatever reason feels like low stakes. I don't know if it's positive negotiation, but it's like very low stakes and it works exceedingly well.
Yeah, and the thing about Between Two Cities where I think it helps is because you genuinely want both deals to work out as well as possible because your score is the lower of your 2 scores, so you want both sides of your trades to be as good, as equitable as possible.
Yep, you're not trying to like hurt one and help the other secretly or whatever, and
exactly,
you're not trying to got anyone. Yeah,
there's no ulterior motives. Yeah.
Yep.
So let's close this out by talking about some of our games that we think best utilize this, right, where they fall on the spectrum most appropriately for our tastes. So, Kellen, what are some of your favorite negotiation games?
I mean, I think that they're all baked into the top 10, and I think there is the asterisk, are we talking about social deduction games or are we not? Because there's certainly a lot of negotiation happening in the Resistance, but I would say the quintessential ones for me are both Dune and Cosmic Encounter, both games that are almost entirely self-balanced by the players, to Mark's chagrin. How did that go? That was a good pronunciation, right? Chagrin.
That was great. Very clear.
Yeah.
I think it's pronounced Sjogren.
Yeah. All you and your covens. And I do believe these are some of the most player-dependent experiences that you can have. And I think one of the things that people often say about Shut Up and Sit Down is that, like, they love games that work to allow their personalities to shine, but that when you get with a group of, like, normal people who aren't super personalities, that they fall flat. And I understand that thought and think that for me, it's like, it can't just be role-playing, right? There has to be a game. So maybe what we're actually doing in Dune is just role-playing at the end of the day, but underneath it, I think there's a game happening, and maybe that's all it is. And similarly with Cosmic Encounter, it's sort of like everyone gets a special power, and you are playing dress-up, so to speak, with what your power can do, and then you all scream at each other until someone wins, and then the game ends, and everyone has had a good time. And even Archipelago, right, is an amazing example of a heavy Euro game that also has very strong negotiation elements that are baked into the design, and somehow it works. But I think that's an exception rather than the rule for me. But one game I wanted to just flag is the Spartacus game, which I believe had a new version actually come out this year that's not tied to the TV show, from Gale Force 9. And this is a negotiation / like gladiator game where you're putting your guys in the ring and fighting each other and raising gladiators and stuff. It has been on my list of negotiation games to try, and I just haven't done it yet. And so I must seek it out. But if you love Spartacus, let me know. That'll fuel the fire, and I can make these two yuck-bucks get in there with me and play it.
I think for me, two of my favorite negotiation games are Genoa, which is a game that Kellen introduced me to earlier, which puts negotiation at the forefront while being like a tried and true Euro game. And the other one is Panic on Wall Street, which, playing with our listeners at Shucks a couple of years ago, was one of the best gaming experiences I've ever had. Another game, and Kellen has already mentioned this game specifically, but El Grande is an example of a game that I like, where negotiation is, again, just that light touch. And in fact, while I still enjoy playing El Grande on BGA, and I'm probably in a couple of games of it right now, I think it loses a lot with an async online implementation rather than being around the table and being able to sort of joke about, don't come into like the region where I have my Grande in, and that table talk, I think when it's missing in the async, really hurts my enjoyment of the game.
And it's like, just to double down, as KFC would want us to say, that moment when you place the workers in a region and Mark goes, I don't know about that. Like, that is a negotiation, right?
Yeah.
And that is a moment, and that is some of the high highs of El Grande. And, it's like completely gone on BGA. You go back and you're like reading the log and you're like, what has even transpired since I last logged in here?
I actually think that we've mentioned all of my favorites. Like, we were definitely not going to make it through this episode without me raving about Sidereal Confluence. That's way up there for a game that I think falls on the perfect middle ground of like, hey, puzzly Euro mixed with a very, very solid core of having to negotiate every deal that you're making with players around the table. I'd also be remiss to like not mention, we already mentioned that social deduction is kind of like nebulous in this topic, but The Resistance is one of my favorite games, and like that is back-to-back negotiation. I am actually also very excited. I know that this is so hard to organize, but I would be very excited to do another game of diplomacy. As badly as that game went for me, the memory of it is such a highlight of us all gathered around a table and flitting different parts of the apartment to get backstabbed by Kellen in the subsequent turn.
Oh, I'm always down for some Diplo.
But that is going to wrap it for this week's episode of the show. You can reach out to us on all of our social media, whether that's on Twitter, whether that's on Facebook. We are also on Instagram, and you can come chat to us in Discord. This is a glorified chat room that you can use on your computer or mobile phone. And you can visit us by heading to boardgamebarrage.com/Discord, where they're hanging out, talking board games, and all sorts of other things all of the time. Thank you all so much for listening, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Glory to the chat room.
And welcome to episode number 231. If you rearrange those numbers, it's 1, 2, 3, or 3, 2, 1. That is a good sign. Does that make any sense at all?
If you don't use the numbers in order.
Yeah. If you don't use the numbers in the order that we said them, this is a great episode, which means it's also still a great episode. It's like No.
You could do like it's like a countdown to fun or something.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. If you just rearrange those numbers.
And like part of the funny things about the movie is that like everybody tells them like, wait, what do you mean coven?
Here's the thing, right? Have any of you met a witch?
Not in a while, but
Okay. How do we want to like get in and out of that?
I mean, I'm desperate for an early outro, so I'm
Outro.
taking that for the
Well,
outro.
that's all outro then.
Yeah,
I love
yeah,
it. Okay.
So you can pretend that never happened and just start talking about it.
Keep saying how desperate you are. Like in the gravelly voice, you know? It may help
There you go.
with the aforementioned fanfic.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's get into the feature topic this week, which is negotiation. Callan, you look quizzical.
Nope.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I always do, but yes, thank you for